On what would be Bob Hope's final appearance, the 90-year-old legend didn't come to tell jokes. He came to confess a secret failure involving a soldier facing a terminal condition and a broken promise. What Hope whispered into Carson's ear was a desperate final request that cost the king of late night millions. Johnny Carson, the king of late night, was, for once, not entirely himself. He was the most unflappable man on television, a master of control who could pivot from a joke bombing to a perfect recovery in the space of a single breath. Yet, as the hour of Hope's arrival neared, Johnny was pacing behind the curtain, running his hand over his face. He knew silence was a comedian's worst enemy, but tonight, silence felt like a funeral bell. Ed McMahon, usually roaring with laughter, sat silently at his desk, watching the stage door like a sentry. This wasn't just another appearance. Bob Hope was 90 years old, visibly struggling, and this was universally understood to be his last major television appearance. The producers had been warned to move slowly, to watch for cues, to treat the icon not like a celebrity, but like priceless crystal. Johnny didn't fear a joke falling flat. He feared the profound sadness that comes when an era walks onto your stage, knowing it's about to walk off forever. He and Hope shared an intertwined history dating back decades, a mutual respect forged not just in Hollywood, but in the trenches of war zones where Hope tirelessly brought laughter to boys who had nothing left but their bravery. This segment wasn't about ratings, it was about honoring a lifetime of service, and Johnny felt the overwhelming pressure of being the curator of that final, sacred memory. The audience, largely composed of people who had grown up with Hope's voice echoing through their living rooms, was completely hushed. They knew they needed to be quiet for him. They knew they needed to pay attention. They understood that every word from the 90-year-old comedian might be the last we heard. There was no trademark Carson swagger tonight, only deep responsibility. He approached his desk, fiddled with a cue card, and offered a prayer to the comedy gods. Let me get this right. It was the least he could do for the mentor who had shown him that humor could be medicine, that a perfect joke was sometimes the only barrier between a person and despair. The band launched into the introduction. And now, ladies and gentlemen, for the final time on this program, here is the one, the only, Bob Hope. The applause lasted a full 2 minutes. It was thunderous, emotional, and unending. A sound of love and thanks, a sound of farewell. Bob Hope slowly walked onto the stage, leaning heavily on the arm of a production assistant. The producer's grip was a safety lock. The famous ski-slope nose and sparkling eyes are still there, but the body is clearly failing. Johnny rose from his desk and walked all the way across the stage, breaking talk. Show protocol to meet his friend halfway. He took Hope's arm, guided him gently to the chair, and sat beside him. It was a gesture of protection and deep respect, a quiet acknowledgement of the legend's vulnerability. As the applause finally subsided, Johnny leaned toward the microphone and paused, the script notes he'd prepared suddenly feeling meaningless. He looked at Bob Hope, ready to begin the final conversation. What Johnny didn't realize was that Hope wasn't there to talk about his career. He was there to confess a secret that had been weighing on him for 50 years. And the first clue was how intensely silent the great jokester was about to become. The cameras were rolling, the lights were blazing, and the audience was ready for the familiar sparkle of the world's greatest comedian. But what they got instead was a shadow of silence. Bob Hope, the man who could deliver a joke that traveled 4,000 miles to an entire army, was sitting quietly, holding a tiny, invisible piece of history under the desk. Johnny tried to kick things off with the classic material, reminiscing about the old days. Bob, you've entertained presidents, royalty, and even some of Ed's in-laws, which is quite a feat. The audience tittered, waiting for Hope's legendary rapid-fire wit. But Hope just gave a small, slow smile, a smile that felt distant, as if he were looking back at a horizon only he could see. They were lovely people, John, all lovely people. It was polite, but it lacked the famous punch, the quick retort that had defined his career. Johnny, sensing the unexpected quiet, leaned forward, his genuine concern showing through the mask of the host. He launched into a question about the famous USO tours, a topic usually guaranteed to light up Hope like a Christmas tree. The screen above the stage showed a brief clip of Hope on a makeshift stage in a scorching desert, waving to thousands of smiling servicemen. The audience applauded. Hope looked at the screen and paused. It wasn't a comedic pause for timing, it was a physical hesitation, a catch in his breath. The boys were always the best audience, Hope finally said, his voice soft, almost a whisper. They needed that laugh. They needed it more than they needed breakfast. Johnny pressed gently. I always admired how you never missed a Christmas. How did you keep that going for so long? Hope turned away from the screen, facing Johnny directly, and the look in his eye was one of deep melancholy. You made a promise, John. When you look into the eyes of a young man who knows he may not see the sun rise tomorrow, you make a promise, and you keep it. He spoke the word promise with a heavy, specific emphasis that sent a chill through the studio. Backstage, the producers exchanged frantic glances. This wasn't the script. Hope's hand, resting on his knee, subtly adjusted the small object he was clutching. It was barely visible to the camera, a small, dark shape. It was an old, tarnished military pin, not the shining kind you'd see on a dress uniform, but something worn and cheap, perhaps a canteen badge or a forgotten insignia. He was holding a token of failure, and he polished it ceaselessly, as if trying to erase the tarnish of 50 years. He rubbed the metal with his thumb, a repetitive, obsessive gesture that betrayed the inner turmoil he was trying to hide. The audience, sensing the shift from comedy to gravitas, had fallen completely silent, waiting for the weight of Hope's decades of experience to finally deliver its truth. Johnny tried one last time to lighten the mood, reaching for a prepared joke about Bing Crosby, but Hope's hand shot up, a sudden, sharp movement that was the most energy he'd shown in the entire segment. No, John, not tonight, not a lie. He wasn't avoiding the joke, he was dismissing the whole idea of performance. He was finally ready to stop performing life and start living it, right there on the air. The legendary comedian refused the easy laugh, refusing the comfort of his own jokes because he was staring directly into a decades-old memory, a painful secret that was held tight in the palm of his 90-year-old hand, and he was about to make Carson carry the weight of it. If the profound history between these two icons touches your heart, hit that subscribe button right now. Don't miss a single part of this extraordinary story. The smile that Bob Hope gave was gone, replaced by the look of a man suddenly walking through a dusty, jungle memory, a memory he had kept locked away while the world celebrated him as a tireless hero. He didn't just falter when Johnny brought up the tours, he physically retreated, turning his gaze inward to a specific, painful day in late 1968. Johnny, sensing the shift from wistful nostalgia to something heavy and specific, mentioned the Christmas tour of Vietnam, a trip famous for its danger and emotional intensity. Hope slowly nodded. Vietnam, he whispered. It was the hardest one, the quietest one. We were supposed to fly into a place called Chu Lai on the coast, but the weather was horrible. Instead, they put us down near a MASH unit in Da Nang. A young private first class Miller was waiting for me at Chu Lai. Hope stopped, his voice rough. PFC Miller was 19 years old, just a boy. He had been severely wounded in an ambush 3 days before. They told him the only thing that might get him through the surgery was knowing Bob Hope was coming to tell him a joke. The camera zoomed slightly on Hope's face, catching the unshed moisture in his eyes. Hope explained that he had sent word ahead to PFC Miller. Hold on, son. The show's coming to you. But the fog at Chu Lai was too thick. The plane was diverted. When Hope finally made it to the coast 2 days later, PFC Miller was gone. He passed, John. The doctor told me the boy held on for 36 hours after the surgery, waiting for me. He had a fever, and he kept whispering, Hope's coming, I gotta hear the joke. Hope leaned his head back against the chair, the silence in the studio now thick enough to cut. The icon who had made millions laugh confessed he had failed the one boy who needed him most. I was responsible for that boy's last hope, John, and I let him down. I let him down because of the fog. The audience heard the tremor in his voice and understood this wasn't a planned story. This was a lifetime of regret spilling out onto the stage. Hope's tireless work over the next 3 decades, the thousands of shows, the millions of miles, had always been his penance, his private effort to make up for the promise he couldn't keep to PFC Miller. But it was never enough. He never told this story before, not even to his closest friends. It was the forgotten, devastating cost of his immense global fame, the single tear in his tapestry of service. Johnny sat motionless, suddenly realizing the tarnished pin in Hope's hand wasn't an insignificant piece of metal. It was a tangible link to that 19-year-old soldier, an object Hope had kept as a painful, constant reminder. The weight of the unspoken promise, the failure that haunted the king of comedy, was suddenly heavier than any war joke. And as Johnny Carson's unflappable facade began to visibly waver, the audience knew the tragedy of PFC Miller was about to become the tragedy of their host, too. The famous Tonight Show desk, a symbol of stability and control where Johnny Carson had reigned supreme for 30 years, suddenly seemed like a flimsy shield against the tidal wave of Bob Hope's ancient grief. Carson glanced at a silly, oversized cue card bearing the night's scheduled opening gag, a joke about airline food, and the joke itself seemed to shrivel under the profound weight of Hope's confession. Johnny realized in that instant that this was not a story meant for television, but a eulogy meant for a MASH tent. Hope wasn't seeking applause. He was seeking absolution for a decades-long burden. Carson, the consummate professional, tried to perform his duty. "Bob," he said, his voice husky, "you brought joy to literally millions of boys who would have otherwise been completely lost. You're a hero. No one blames you for the weather." But Hope shook his head, looking down at the small, tarnished pin in his hand. "Blame is easy, John," he said, his voice heavy with self-reproach. "The promise is what matters. I promised him I'd be there. And I wasn't. That boy's mama sent me this pin after he passed away, saying he held it when he was waiting. It's been my penance, John. A constant whisper that fame doesn't mean a thing when you let one kid down." The great comedian was essentially asking the audience and the world for forgiveness for a failure only he knew about. The sight of the legendary, unflappable Johnny Carson struggling to maintain his composure was perhaps the most unsettling thing the crew and the audience had ever witnessed. His smile, the trademark half-smirk that could diffuse any tension, dissolved entirely. His eyes, usually sharp and witty, were wide with pain and understanding. He saw not just Hope's failure, but the terrifying vulnerability of every entertainer who strives to matter. He reached for his glass of water, his hand shaking slightly, a tiny, physical tremor that television seldom captured in the king of late night. Ed McMahon, witnessing his friend's quiet struggle, knew exactly what was happening. Johnny was losing the fight against his own empathy. He was too deep into the sorrow of his friend. Ed, the silent guardian, looked desperately to the stage manager and subtly gave the signal. The director, seeing Carson's composure shatter on the monitor, had only 2 seconds to act. He didn't hit commercials, he hit the panic button. A moment later, the music surged, the unmistakable transition to a commercial break, but it was too early. The camera pulled back as the orchestra began playing too quickly, trying to cover the massive emotional gap that had opened on the stage. But before Johnny could stand or acknowledge the break, Bob Hope leaned in, his 90-year-old voice dropping to a harsh, intimate whisper, and that single short sentence completely stopped Carson mid-motion. Johnny Carson's famous composure cracked under the weight of this secret, leading to an early commercial break. Drop a comment below and tell us about a time you saw a famous person drop their public persona and show their true humanity. The commercial break was an immediate, chaotic contradiction to the quiet sorrow that had descended over the stage, a sudden, brutal transition from the hushed trauma of war to the blaring enthusiasm of breakfast cereal ads. Producers and assistants rushed the stage, shouting directions, but Johnny Carson was oblivious, frozen in place by the sound of Bob Hope's voice. Hope had leaned in, his face close to Carson's ear, the microphone pulled back by an alert stagehand. The moment was strictly private, a secret that only 2 men, the failing icon and his stunned successor, would ever share. Johnny had been mid-movement, reaching for the water glass, but when Hope spoke, every muscle in Carson's body simply locked up. The short sentence, delivered in a voice scratchy with age and emotion, struck Carson not like words, but like a physical blow. His hand missed the glass entirely, his fingers splayed, and a cue card he had been fiddling with slipped from his grasp, fluttering harmlessly to the famous, pristine floor. The look that crossed Johnny's face in that immediate half-second was devastatingly complex. Not just surprise or sadness, but absolute, profound surrender. It was the look of a man who suddenly realized the weight of his own destiny had just been defined, not by his jokes, but by the suffering of his friend. Bob Hope, satisfied that his message had landed, sat back slowly, the tarnished military pin still clutched in his hand, his eyes now closed as if he had just completed a grueling journey. Johnny stared straight ahead, his gaze fixed on the audience but seeing nothing. He was processing the meaning of those hushed words, a meaning so singular and powerful, it completely eclipsed the 20 million people watching at home. The crew, used to Johnny's professional snapback, were unnerved by his stillness. He was supposed to be talking to Ed, prepping the next segment, or taking direction from the producer, but he just sat there breathing shallowly. The producer, Fred, leaned down to ask if he was all right, and Johnny simply held up a trembling hand. A silent, absolute demand for silence. He needed the space to absorb the incredible burden his friend had just passed to him. It was a single 12-word sentence, a powerful confession that wasn't about PFC Miller, but about the very core of their shared lives. A statement that reframed the entire purpose of their careers. The weight of comedy, the decades of jokes, the hours spent trying to make people forget their troubles. Hope's whisper reduced it all to one definitive, beautiful summary. The commercial break was about to end, and Johnny Carson had to stand up and finish the show. But he knew the man who sat down moments ago was gone forever. He had just been given the heaviest gift imaginable, a secret so profound that the king of late night was about to expose the deepest, most vulnerable part of himself to the entire nation. The cameras snapped back on, the theme music faded awkwardly, and the audience, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, leaned forward, witnessing a Johnny Carson they had never seen. A man pale, still kneeling beside Bob Hope's chair, his legendary control completely gone. He was no longer the host, he was simply a grieving friend. Bob Hope sat motionless, his eyes closed. Johnny stayed kneeling for another moment, gathering the strength not to perform, but to simply tell the truth. He stood up slowly, looking not at the camera but directly at the audience, the millions of Americans who had invited him into their homes every night for 3 decades. He opened his mouth to speak, and his voice immediately failed, catching in his throat a sound so raw and unexpected that the entire studio gasped. He put a hand over his mouth, turned his back to the audience for a brief, desperate moment, and when he faced them again, the tears were streaming freely down his face. It was the moment the king of late night finally and irrevocably broke down on live television. Ed McMahon, his faithful co-pilot, was emotionally overcome at his desk, wiping his own eyes with a handkerchief. Doc Severinsen, the man of 1,000 smiles, simply took off his glasses and looked away. When Johnny finally found his voice, it was rough, strained, and completely devoid of the usual Carson lightness. "I apologize," he managed to say, his voice thick with emotion. "I apologize to you, and I apologize to my friend, Bob Hope." He walked slowly back to the desk, picked up the cue card that had fluttered to the floor, and tore it in half, an act of symbolic finality. "I had a joke about airline food here," he confessed, "but there are no jokes left in the world right now." He then turned and looked directly at Hope, who slowly opened his eyes. What Bob just told me in the commercial break was a single sentence. It wasn't a joke, it wasn't a secret about Hollywood, it was about us. It was about why we ever bothered to do any of this. He paused, choked up again, fighting for control. Then, with a tear running down his cheek, he shared the whisper, the 12 words that had destroyed his composure, delivered not to the camera, but to the entire soul of America. "We made God's children laugh, Johnny. That's all that matters now." The weight of that profound statement, a benediction and a final assessment of their life's work, hit the audience like a tidal wave. It was Hope's realization that their legacy wasn't in the ratings or the awards, but in the simple, sacred act of easing human sorrow. It was the torch of responsibility passed from the old master to the new. Johnny turned back to the audience, the confession complete. "He taught me something just now," Carson whispered, shaking his head. "He taught me that the biggest difference we can make is to laugh with the people who are suffering." The room was filled with the sounds of soft, quiet weeping, a shared moment of unscripted humanity that transcended all television formality. Bob Hope, having passed his most sacred truth to his friend, gave a slow, satisfied nod. The whisper had done its work, but Johnny knew that simply crying wasn't enough. He knew he had to act on the enormous responsibility his friend had just given him. Johnny Carson's public breakdown and the reveal of Bob Hope's powerful whisper is the emotional climax of our story. If this unscripted moment of humanity touched you, please share the story with someone who needs a reminder of what truly matters. The atmosphere in Studio One was not defined by applause, but by a profound, reverent silence, a shared, collective holding of breath that lingered long after the commercial break returned. Every single person in that room, from the lighting director to the third-row balcony audience member, had just witnessed the complete and voluntary surrender of the king of late night's most guarded secret, his heart. Ed McMahon, who had stood by Johnny through every triumph and flop for 3 decades, looked like he had seen a phantom. The camera crew was openly wiping their eyes, the boom operator holding his microphone steady with visible effort. This moment was instantly preserved in the archives of television history, not for what was said, but for the raw emotion that poured out when Johnny revealed the profound simplicity of Hope's final words. The whisper, "We made God's children. Laugh, Johnny. That's all that matters now," was not just a comment on their shared profession, it was a final, spiritual accounting of Bob Hope's 90 years. For Johnny, it was the crushing weight of responsibility, the understanding that this torch, forged in the mud of the Pacific and carried through every conflict since, was now being placed squarely in his hands. Carson was realizing that the purpose of his immense fame wasn't to secure ratings, but to alleviate suffering. This emotional aftermath was not the usual television crying. It was a catharsis shared by millions who understood the unspoken weight of legacy. Johnny took a moment to compose himself, but the famous Carson cool was thoroughly gone, replaced by a genuine, tear-streaked sincerity. He knelt down again, not to cry, but to honor his friend. He looked Bob Hope in the eye, and the exchange was long, intimate, and silent. He understood why the story of PFC Miller was so important now. It wasn't about the one boy Hope couldn't reach, it was about every boy Carson still could reach. The pain in Hope's heart for a 19-year-old soldier was the very thing that destroyed Carson's unflappable composure. It was the realization that the business of comedy was never just about jokes, it was about human worth. Johnny stood again, wiping the last vestiges of moisture from his eyes, and the audience remained absolutely silent, waiting. He knew he couldn't just transition to the next guest, not after this emotional eruption. The simple, honest reality of Bob Hope's final confession demanded an answer, a pledge, a new path forward that would honor the profound spiritual contract just established between 2 legendary men. He looked at Bob Hope, who nodded slightly, almost imperceptibly, urging him to speak the commitment into existence. A classic Carson gag often involved a terrible letter submitted to the monologue, a joke so bad it was instantly thrown away, a piece of ephemeral comedy that vanished the moment it was delivered. Yet tonight, Johnny's gaze landed on the desk where he had prepared an entire monologue of such gags, and he understood they were utterly meaningless in the face of Hope's whisper. The king of late night took a deep breath, the moisture still shining around his eyes, and addressed the camera with a gravity that transcended his role as a host. He knew he couldn't just tell the audience that the moment was important. He had to show them how Bob Hope's grief over a single 19-year-old soldier, PFC Miller, was about to change the world. "Folks," Johnny said, his voice now steady but low, "we've spent the last 30 years of my life trying to give you an hour of escape. We try to make you forget the troubles of the world. But my friend, Bob Hope, just reminded me that our true job isn't escape, it's repair." He explained that Bob Hope carried the immense regret of one young life lost, a life that simply needed a joke to hold on to. "And if the great Bob Hope still carries that pain," Carson continued, "then we, who benefited from his laughter, have to finish his mission." He wiped his hands on his trousers and made a completely unscripted, unprecedented announcement, one that caught the producers staring in disbelief. He was funding a massive philanthropic effort on the fly, using the shame of one forgotten soldier to save thousands. "So right now, tonight, I'm putting my money where my heart is. I'm announcing the immediate creation of a foundation. It will be an anonymous foundation. You will never hear its name on this show again. But its sole purpose will be to find and provide aid, shelter, and dignity to the forgotten veterans of Vietnam." He paused, looking at Hope, who had tears of his own now running down his cheeks. "And we are naming it in spirit and honor, after the boy who never got his last joke. We are naming it for PFC Miller." The applause that finally erupted wasn't polite or professional. It was a genuine standing ovation that vibrated with catharsis, relief, and pride. The audience wasn't clapping for Johnny Carson the celebrity, but for Johnny Carson the man who had finally allowed his decency to become public. Bob Hope slowly reached into his palm and unfolded his fingers. He held out the small, tarnished military pin, the canteen badge of PFC Miller, and placed it gently into Johnny Carson's hand. It was an act of complete transfer. The penance was over, and the mission now belonged to the next generation. Johnny gripped the cold metal of the pin, a physical piece of history suddenly resting in his palm, and he knew this was the start of the greatest promise he would ever keep. But before the cameras cut away, Bob Hope leaned in one final time, ready to share the second, heavier secret, the one that necessitated this public act of generosity. The studio lights were dimmed, the audience was gone, and the famous Tonight Show set looked vast and empty, like a cathedral after the congregation had departed. Only Johnny Carson, Bob Hope, and a trusted, silent producer remained. And it was in this hushed vacuum that Hope finally revealed the true, urgent reason for his public confession. Johnny was still clutching PFC Miller's tarnished pin, the physical token of his new commitment. He helped Bob Hope from his chair and guided him gently off the stage. Once they were truly alone, away from the prying ears of the remaining crew, Hope placed a hand on Carson's arm. "John," he murmured, his voice now weak and strained. The whisper, it was a final request, not just a philosophy. I needed to know that my final burden, the promise I couldn't keep, would be lifted and carried by someone worthy. Johnny looked at his mentor, suddenly seeing the profound weariness behind the sparkle in the old man's eyes. The tears Hope had shed on camera were not just for PFC Miller, they were for himself. "I don't have much time left, John," Hope confessed, his voice barely audible. "The doctors have been clear. It's moving quickly now. I needed this promise made while I could still see your face." He explained that he had deliberately orchestrated the appearance, choosing Carson's show for its immense reach and Johnny's deep, hidden compassion. The confession of PFC Miller was not just for the audience, but a strategic pressure point, the only way to force the famously private Carson to act publicly and immediately. Hope's greatest fear was not his end, but that his lifelong mission of honoring servicemen would be over when he was gone. He needed Carson to inherit the torch of quiet service. "I needed you to cry, John," Hope said, the shadow of a smile returning. "I needed you to be so overcome that you couldn't retreat into the jokes. I needed you to commit that foundation on live television so you couldn't back out." Johnny understood then the immense, manipulative love of his friend. Hope wasn't selfish. He was desperate to ensure that the forgotten heroes, the young men who were still out there suffering, would finally have a champion. Carson squeezed the pin in his hand, making a second, even more important promise. "I will honor the foundation, Bob, but I will also honor your privacy. I will tell no one what you just told me. You will reach your end with dignity on your own terms, and the world will remember the tireless hero, not the frail old man." Hope nodded, the weight of his secret finally gone, passed to the man he trusted most. The contract was sealed, not in a handshake, but in a quiet vow in the darkness of an empty studio. Carson would carry the mission, and he would carry the secret of his friend's final days, guarding Bob Hope's privacy until the very end. May 22nd, 1992. It was the final episode of The Tonight Show, starring Johnny Carson, the night the lights went out on American late night for good. But for Johnny, the true farewell had already happened years ago, in the darkness of the studio after his friend's final visit. The show was, fittingly, filled with tributes and laughter, a perfect bow on a legendary career. But when Johnny gave his final, emotional wave, the cameras lingered on the stage as he walked toward the curtain for the last time. He paused, looking out over the empty seats of the studio audience, his gaze fixed on the spot where Bob Hope's chair had sat years before. And then, in the deep shadow just beyond the camera line, there he was. Bob Hope, not the frail man who had whispered his secret, but an upright, dignified figure standing alone in the darkness. He touched his own wrist where his watch should have been, Hope hadn't come to the show, he was just there for Johnny, a single, silent figure giving a final, private goodbye to the man who had kept his promise. Hope simply nodded slowly, his face etched with pride. It was a silent, powerful affirmation that the work had been done, the mantle carried, the secret protected. That was the moment Johnny truly retired. He didn't leave because he was tired of comedy. He left because Bob Hope's whisper had taught him that the world of private compassion was more important than the world of public applause. The foundation, established anonymously in honor of PFC Miller, became Carson's true life's work in the subsequent years. While the world debated his golf handicap, Johnny was quietly moving millions of dollars to aid veterans, ensuring that Hope's final request was honored with meticulous care. He never spoke of that emotional night with Hope publicly. If pressed, he would simply smile and deflect with a joke, protecting the dignity of his mentor to the end. The single constant reminder, however, was the tarnished military pin, which remained in his wallet, a touchstone that weighed more than any Emmy award. That single pin symbolized the weight of a life lived for others. The whisper had liberated Carson, showing him that fame was merely currency for good deeds. Success wasn't about the numbers on the screen, it was about the number of veterans the PFC Miller Foundation could quietly help. Bob Hope passed away many years later, remembered exactly as he wished, a tireless entertainer and American hero. But Johnny Carson reached his end, knowing that he had done right by his friend, carrying the burden and the legacy. The real farewell was the silent nod in the darkness of the empty studio, a perfect, unscripted ending to the greatest friendship in comedy. If this extraordinary, unscripted moment between two legends reminded you of the power of true human connection, please hit the like button on this video. And for more stories about the private lives and profound legacies of the figures who shaped history, subscribe right now.